So hello and good afternoon to our probably last new economy shortcut this year, except there's an urgency in the last 2 days before Christmas, but I don't suppose and I hope so. So we are very happy to have an exciting debate and an exciting topic that turns around the very impressive book that Simon Johnson and Daron Acemoglu have written, Power and Progress. We are doing this for the second time in cooperation with the OECD, the Berlin Centre. And so, Nicola, I introduce you just quickly as head of the OECD Berlin Centre, and you will moderate the session. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Thomas, and welcome to Shortcut to the Two. Indeed, we are very lucky to have Simon Johnson with us, who will present his newest book with a really great title, I think, Power and Progress. Simon is a professor of entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's an author of multiple best-selling books on the financial crisis and also on technological progress, like this one. And I'm sure you'll enjoy his presentation. And after that, we have Achim Wambach, who will comment. Achim is leads the Zentrum für Europäische Wirtschaftsforschung in Mannheim. He's also an expert on innovation and technological progress competition. So this promises to be a very exciting debate. You can ask questions in the chat, and without further ado, Simon, I'm looking forward to what you're going to tell us about your book.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thanks, Thomas, for the introductions and the opportunity. So I'll just say a few things about the book, Nicola, really three main points, and then we can get to more of the discussion. The first point is about the choice of technology, which I think is a central idea. The second point is about whether there is or is not what we call a productivity bandwagon. And the third question is about where we stand in the United States and in Europe and in other places with regard to policies that might get us to better outcomes. So on the issue of choice, let me frame it this way. If we were meeting in person, I would ask people to raise their hands. Sometimes people are obviously a bit shy about this, but I would ask people how many of them are techno-optimists, so really optimistic about where we stand vis-a-vis technology, particularly artificial intelligence, AI. And, you know, in many of the groups I talk to, at least in the United States, also internationally, about a third of the people feel very positive about where this is going. Big productivity transformations. The problem of the future will be how to handle some form of universal basic income and so on. Another third of the people, in many cases, are quite pessimistic. They feel that this is coming at us very fast. They feel that the safeguards are essentially non-existent, which I think is actually true. And there will be a lot of destruction of jobs. We can explore that. There's an element of that. And that will result in massive amounts of unemployment. The productivity gains will not be large enough in this view to really offset the disruptions, the loss of jobs. And therefore, there's going to be real problems putting enough income into the hands of people at the lower end of the income distribution. Now, our view in this book is neither the optimistic view nor the pessimistic view. We are arguing strenuously that it could go either way, that this is a choice. And we mean this really quite seriously. And we've gone back and looked at essentially all of recorded human history around technology. The book is called Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, but we dig back further to the extent that there's anything specific and definite that we can see in the record. And it seems to us that sometimes you do get, if you have a certain kind of people in charge, an elite that's thinking mostly about themselves, let's say, you do get technology that benefits that elite that doesn't lead to much by way of shared prosperity. And we have a number of prominent instances. I'll touch on a couple in a moment where that's what happened. But it's also possible, and it did happen in Europe and in the United States and other countries from the middle of the 19th century, that the technology was pulled in a direction that was much more favorable to raising wages and raising living standards across a broad swath of humanity. Now, a couple of caveats in that statement. One very important one is that was Europe and the United States. It wasn't the entire world. And we will hopefully explore what are the implications for the rest of the world also in this AI transformation or potential revolution we're looking at. The other key point, of course, is that statement, which was quite broad, I will agree, but that statement really only applies up until about the 1980s, at least with regard to the United States. Something happened in our technology generation and deployment process. So after the 1980s, instead of having a rising tide lifting all boats, as people like to say, we got a polarization of the job market. So David Autor, with whom Daron and I run a center at MIT researching the future of work, David Autor has done really careful analysis over a long period of time, I think identifying beyond any reasonable doubt that particularly for men in the United States, but also for women, there's been a big divergence in labor market outcomes. People with a lot of education, particularly men with a lot of education, have done very well from digital transformation the last 40 years. And men without much education didn't finish college, didn't start college, didn't finish high school. They are, in real terms, not, perhaps many of them, earning as much as they did even in the 1960s. So a really dramatic polarization. And that, I think, and we fear, is absolutely on the cards. But this is the key point. It doesn't have to be that way. There is a choice, and that choice rests with, well, with whom, right? Well, I think it rests with us. I think it rests with our political leaders. I think it rests with the people who invent technology. And we'll come back and try to link all those people together in a few minutes. So the second point is about the productivity bandwagon. And now, this is a phenomenon that we claim is so widely believed in economics, doesn't even have a name. So we gave it a name, productivity bandwagon. And the idea is that if technology improves, productivity rises, the demand for labor increases, that will pull up wages and otherwise benefit living standards so that everybody gains eventually. And the next time somebody makes this argument to you, I would like you, please, to push them on this word eventually, because you do see this in a lot of places, including, for example, The Economist magazine, I think goes there all the time. So in the 1780s in Britain, we know for a fact there was a transformation of productivity in cotton spinning, then cotton weaving. There was also big improvements of productivity in coal mining, in steelworking, and a number of other related sectors, 1780s. We also know that in the 1840s, 60 years later, children in the north of England, where I'm from, children as young as 6 would spend 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, deep underground in the pitch black, pushing coal carts with their head. That was a job for young children. 60 years after the most profound transformation in industrial productivity ever. So what was going on there? Well, we can go through that. We've got some fairly hefty material on this in the book, but essentially all the gains from that early industrial revolution were captured by the owners of capital, by the people at the top. Very little percolated down. In fact, if you look at how people lived in big industrial cities, I'm from Sheffield, we have a bit more data for Manchester, but I think the same thing applies across all those industrial cities. The living conditions in the 1830s into the 1840s were absolutely abysmal and worse than people like that had lived, go back 100 years, right? So the point of the book is to show this in many instances, also to show there have been positive cases. Early 20th century United States, for example, US auto industry in 1900 employed about 2,400 people, making a couple of thousand cars. By 1929, the GM and Ford both produced 1.5 million cars. The US auto industry employed 400,000 people, most of whom were making pretty good money for the day, right? So we have had, and we did have, in the 20th century, starting in the actually late 19th century and going through much of the 20th century, obviously there were some big disruptions in the 20th century, but the underlying productivity and shared prosperity dynamic was absolutely there. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, that was the predominant trend across what we now call to be industrial economies. Which leads to the third question, and it's my final point, which is, do we have what it takes to get back to something like that? Obviously, you can't go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Those days are gone. You can't go back to the 1870s. But what were the key ingredients then? And can we get anything like that now? Well, the three key points that we argue it mattered were, first of all, the process of automation, replacing people with machines, which has been an essential part of industrial transformation, in fact, essential part of technology transformation for as long as it's happened. That automation was complemented by new task creation. So people were replaced by machines on Henry Ford's production line. When he made a moving production line, when he brought electricity to that production line, there were fewer tasks for people, but he and the manager engineers around him and his competitors created a lot of new tasks. Many of those tasks, probably most of them, required some expertise. When you require expertise, you don't want those workers to quit right away because it's difficult to find replacements, hard to train them, and so on. You pay a premium wage. So new task creation, absolutely fundamental. And our economies have become much less good at that in the digital age. Second point is called trade unions. There were big fights in Detroit, including in the 1930s, to ensure that some of the benefits of this much higher productivity from the car companies were shared with workers in terms of higher pay and other benefits. And those deals, those were big fights, by the way. This was acrimonious, it was very tough, but that established what became the shared prosperity model of the US in the post-war period. And similar stories play out in other industrial economies. The third change, of course, was political, that all of our democracies were pretty rudimentary at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And there was a long, drawn-out process. I mean, in the UK, it lasted at least 80 years to establish that workers had equal rights, had the right to form a trade union, which, of course, was not established at the beginning, but they also had political rights, including representation in parliament and so on and so forth. Again, the story is different in various countries that industrialized at that time, but it also runs remarkably parallel. So how are we doing in terms of new task creation today? Not great. How are we doing in terms of unionization? Well, in the US, private sector unions are at almost an all-time low. There's been a bit of a bounce back after COVID, but we'll see if that lasts. And the political process is severely damaged and disrupted, I would say, by many forces, including the forces of technology through social media and the way in which that interacts with various anxieties and angers that people have. The advent of AI in that sector, I think, is just going to make things worse. The advent of AI puts more downward pressure on jobs in some sectors. I think there's more pressure on the unions. And one big thing that David and Daron and I work on at MIT is to what extent we can identify, find, and encourage the development of technologies or paths for technology that generates more new tasks. I think this is a big challenge. I think there are some pieces that can come together. There's a lot of discussion about the so-called new industrial strategy of the United States. Some of that is good, some of it is more problematic, but more of that can be pushed in the direction of job creation. I think it's going to be a struggle. I think it's a 2 to 5 year struggle. I do think the US is likely, but not definite, to find its way onto a better path. But I'm really worried about the rest of the world. Okay, I'm not so worried about Europe because I think you also have some good mechanisms in play. Looking forward to some commentary on that. But if you take the 6 billion people in the world today who don't live easy lives and are already struggling to survive in the way the global market operates, if you bring a mass amount of automation to the global economy, the way that's going to impact trade, the way that's going to impact manufacturing, the way that's going to impact jobs in low-income and middle-income countries, I think there's a level of trauma and difficulty awaiting us, which is surely not unprecedented, but it is going to be very difficult for those countries and those people to overcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Simon. And I think if I may briefly interpret what Simon just told us is that I've discovered that here we have an MIT professor and a former IMF chief economist who's a techno-pessimist and a trade unionist. So Achim, that's my interpretation, of course. Achim, how about you? Are you a techno-pessimist, an optimist? Do you think that in this book it lays out the problems that we are facing right now correctly, and what to do with this?
Yeah, no, thanks for the invitation, and then Simon, thanks for the introduction and giving me the possibility to read your book. So just because it's not has been shown yet, so at least one person should show the book. So here's the book, yeah, and it's really great to read. When Nicola asked me, whether I would be willing to comment, I thought, well, it's great to have a book by you and joined with Daron. You didn't mention that it has 500 pages, yes. So, and I said yes before I learned that, yeah. But it's really fun to read, and there are a lot of stories in it, and it was really enjoyable. And the topic is, I think, it's under-researched. Shall we steer innovation, and what does it mean? Yeah, so to really leverage innovation. So that's really fun, and you start thinking about it, going through all these cases in the book. Maybe because Nicola, you mentioned that it's a little bit the American-German thing, I would say. In Germany, I don't think that people are too optimistic about technology. So we just got out of nuclear energy, yeah, because we worry about nuclear energy. We, don't talk with Germans about genetically modified foods. It doesn't work. And even, our trade agreement with Americans failed because we were worried by the chlorine-treated chicken. the way the Americans treat their chicken, yeah, and the Germans were it, or I think the Europeans were it. Anyway, I think you can't be too, too optimistic in Europe about the technology, and also, but I think that's a general point. Technology is really the big leverage we have, and we should not tell the story that, we have problems with technology, but the story is, and that's in the book, how to steer technology. And let me give you one example, just because that's always when I, read it, it's really, it's impressive. You mentioned the Haber-Bosch procedure in your book also, and also the negative effect. But the Haber-Bosch procedure was artificial fertilizer. And at that time, there were studies that we can only have 2 billion people on the world without that invention. Now we have 8 billion. So that invention, which is also called the greatest invention of mankind, is feeding, 6 billion people. So it's a huge success. So technology is really doing well. One point on your book is you have these good stories. And because we are talking about how to steer technology, one should also discuss those cases where they have tried to steer it, but they have failed. So the example, France and United Kingdom, when they started with the Concorde, they spent a lot of money in that direction, and then it was a failure. In Germany with our Transrapid, yeah, so it's an invention, and they nurtured it, but it was a failure. And I would say the Soviet Union was a failure in steering innovation. Yeah, so they were in the 50s, 60s. That was the leading field. They were first in many fields in science, but they couldn't keep track of it. Yeah, and that has to do because they steered it. One intellectual point I want to make, because that's, it's if you comment on a book, and I'm curious to hear your opinion. What you say in your book is you need good institutions to steer technological progress in the right direction. Yeah, like unions and other. So institutions matter. And I would argue that you need innovations to form good institutions. So the causality may also be the other way around. And to give you one example, that's the Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion substances, 1987. That's an institution, but it was only formed after alternatives to these HCFCs were available. So you need first technological process, and then you can have the institutions. So it's, there is causality going in both directions. I guess we will debate about what does it mean for today, and you have 3 really good chapters on digitization, artificial intelligence, what it means for democracy. And I only want to make 2 points. One is the labor market. You mentioned also, and you have quite a bit on labor market in your book. There are these debates which in the book that technological change used to be labor augmenting, but nowadays we have this, so it helped labor, yeah, but nowadays it's the more skill and task biased technological change. So if you don't have the skill which is helped, you lose out, yeah, and then you see this polarization. That's true. However, okay, you mentioned economists, and we shouldn't believe everything was written in the Economist, but they had as a title the golden age of workers. Yeah, and there are also academic conferences on the golden age of workers. So at the moment, we are talking about a world where we have a shortage of skilled labor, at least in the industrialized countries. So at the moment, it seems to me the labor problem is less of a problem, and also with regard to AI and digitalization. Second point I want to make is I fully, accept the analysis, and digitization and artificial intelligence helps a lot, but it creates a lot of problems. The point here is in Europe, we have many acts to go against it. Actually, I think we are advanced, before the United States in that regard. We have the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is in the final stage of the process. We have the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act. We have data protection law. But there's one substantial problem with all these acts. They tend to protect the large firms. They are big problems for the small firms. And as a general argument, they kind of steer the innovation which is already there. And what you would like to have is you want to have institutions which steer innovations which are to come. Yeah, and you could argue actually with these acts that we freeze the innovation which are available in Europe. And what we observe is that both the Americans and the Chinese are surpassing us because they don't restrict the innovation like what we do in Europe. And so that's my final remark. Steering innovation always bears the risks that it prevents innovation. Yeah, and one should be really careful, you know, that one keeps one without, you know, losing the other. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Achim. And I think I have it now established that we are facing an American, even with British origins, an American professor who's a techno-pessimist and a trade unionist, and a German professor who's a techno-optimist. And at least in the current tech context, basically, if I'm a bit exaggerating, said we don't even need trade unions because the labor shortages will do that work. Anyway, to be more serious, Simon, so I have one question from the audience that you kind of brought upon yourself by being so leftish, let's say, because there's somebody from the audience who asks, which role do taxes play? Should governments increase taxes to better spread the benefits of new technologies? Should technologies as such, for example, robots, be taxed? So that's one question I have to you. And after that, I have another, of course, which comes from me, but please, taxes.
Yes, so I think that's a very good question about public policy. I hope we get into this. Certainly there's a role for tax policy and tax expenditures, as we call them in the US. And I think a good example of that would be, so Achim mentioned the Montreal Protocol, which is a fantastic example, and the technology making the institutions possible. Of course, what we've done with renewable energy, clean energy, in the United States and other places, is we put big subsidies in to encourage the technology to improve, right, Achim, to scale it up and to drive down the cost curve. And that then makes it possible to imagine rules or agreements or frameworks or whatever you want to call them that would further limit carbon emissions. So I like the technology institutions interacting with each other. And in that, Nicola, I think taxes are very important, in part because they're hard to avoid, in part because we can get congressional support for tax expenditures. As for taxing robots, I think here Achim's his critique or concern is I think all his points are valid, but I think this one has a very sharp point, which is taxing robots is not something we support at this stage. We think it's a bit of a blunt instrument. We're not trying to slow down automation. Achim's point is your competitors will charge ahead and that can create problems. We are trying to complement automation with new task creation. So and the precise relationship between these things is hard to say, may change in the future. And also politically, honestly, stopping or slowing down innovation in the United States is extremely hard. So we're trying to steer technology by adding dimensions to it and particularly focusing on new task creation, which, Nicola, if we're going to define this as the new trade union view, that would be terrific for me. But you have to persuade the trade unionists to go with this too, because they're still a little bit more in an older model.
Thank you very much, Simon. And in order to link what you said and what Achim said a little bit and create a debate here, what I would like, so Achim pointed to the Concord, right, and to the Soviet Union. And he said, well, look, these people tried to steer technological progress and it didn't go very well. But is that, and then he pointed out that when you have regulation, there's always a risk that you actually stifle innovation, market entry, that you protect those who are already in the market. And what I would like to know from you, Simon, is that the kind of steering of technological progress that you had in mind? So my understanding was that you're very much in favor of creative destruction, but it's true that it's not immediately clear when you say, well, we have to steer it a little bit, and you say what we really need is new task creation. Well, how do we do that? How do we make sure that, how do we keep an openness so that new technologies can come up that we haven't even imagined, but still make sure that it serves the many rather than the few without having this picking the winners or whatever critics would call this?
Okay, great questions. Let me break my reply down to three pieces, if I may, Nicola. First of all, on the Soviet Union, I actually worked in the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union collapsed. I worked for a summer for Gosplan. We covered up all the details. It was really a fascinating experience, but didn't make any progress. I also worked for a long time in the former Soviet Union after the walls came down, including in Ukraine. And this was not an innovative society. This was not a society that emphasized innovation or had sensible. They had a lot of rockets. You can see that obviously now still. But in terms of innovation that would more broadly deliver high productivity gains or improve consumer outcomes, that was not a priority. And if anyone wants to read about this, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle is still, I think, the most brilliant account of how those incentives were massively distorted. On the Concorde, Nicola, I think you have to include the United States among the countries that attempted civilian supersonic travel and abandoned it. It's too noisy. They actually ran an experiment over an American city for about 9 months. Nobody could get any sleep. And until you get past the sonic boom problem, it's not going to come back. But look, if venture capital has 1 success out of 10, everyone says, oh, great, they understand risk. If the government has 1 failure out of 10, we call it Solyndra and we have big investigations and we're going to it's a scandal and so on and so forth. So I think the problem, Nicola, is certainly in the US, the way we think about risk and the way we think about what government should do and what risks government should take. Taking more risks, big risks on technology is my advice consistently to the US authorities and to any European authorities who are interested. There's less of them. I think the key point is Achim identified this, is the creative destruction. And our concern with the big tech companies is precisely that because they're already so dominant and because this technology plays to their strengths, including you need a lot of capital, you need a lot of compute to be able to train the models, you need a lot of political clout to keep everybody off your back. We have 3 winners basically in the United States. We have the Microsoft cluster, we have the Google cluster, and we have the Amazon cluster. So that is not exactly encouraging new entry and creative discussion or new ideas, Nicola. And I think this, complementing automation with new tasks requires a lot of new creative, fast thinking, and it's a bit of an uphill struggle. I mean, we talked to CEOs of these big tech companies also, by the way, extremely cordial conversations. They would have fun here today, I'm sure, with us. But their interest is just to make money by hammering away on enterprise versions of OpenAI and so on and so forth, which are. We had a big event at MIT on AI a couple of weeks ago. All the creative people there were so excited about the technology and the way it expands human capabilities. And all the business people were super excited too, but they were excited about cutting jobs, laying off people. They need 6 where they had 7, they need 1 where they had 10, right? So finding a way to push harder on the new capabilities creation, that's what we need to do. And I think that we're going to struggle because of the market dynamic. I think the existing incumbents are, not motivated, and it's not their business and they don't see it as their responsibility. So whose job is it?
If I can ask one follow-up question here, because you're building on the trade union idea. So but these are really, let's say, more traditional technologies, German industry. Perhaps you're a little bit familiar with the fact that at least in bigger companies, trade unions can be very powerful. They have these Betriebsräte who will also make entrepreneurial decisions, including on what kind of technologies do you adopt, how do you adopt them, etc. Now, big tech companies don't have much of a trade union or, I don't know, worker representation. I think maybe you have more insights there. But could that be a model in order to, pick a little bit for individual companies, and then there's sort of a common interest, right, between the entrepreneurs and the workers? Well, in the end, they want the company to succeed, but then workers perhaps have more of a tendency of saying, well, let's pick this technology that augments our capabilities, or let's give us some more training, rather than laying off workers who don't have the right skills, etc. Is that the kind of trade union model, because you said new trade unions, that you would have in mind?
Yes, I should have said, so new for the United States, not new for Germany. Yes, absolutely, Nicola. I have 2 German cars parked outside my house, made by union labor. Very, very, they're not new cars either. They're very reliable pieces of equipment, run for a long time. So I think that worker representation of the German kind is unlikely to take hold in the United States. Different culture, different way corporate governance plays, and so on. But what you're proposing in terms of worker engagement on this issue, and arguing about, how do we augment ourselves? How do we enhance our capabilities? How do we help the company? How do we participate in that? That's the right conversation. What we worry about, Nicola, is in the traditional trade union conversation is, okay, that has happened in some moments of American industrial history. We talk about it in the book. But in general, the union discussion, including a lot of recent discussion, is pay us a higher wage. which you can get if the labor market's tight like it is now, but then you're encouraging the company to automate more, of course, right? So involvement in that discussion about augmenting our capabilities and then compensating for that, that's a smart way to do it. And that's what we suggest and encourage with our various union interactions.
Thanks, Simon. And now, Achim, I have fascinating questions from the audience. I have one that I will give to you by Bernd Fischer, connected with one of my own questions. So he says, Bernd Fischer asks, do you think that wealth taxation may be more innovation friendly than income taxation? And but more broadly, perhaps, I would like to have a view from you about the role of competition in these in the digital tech companies. I mean, they look pretty much close to monopolies, worldwide, global monopolies, sometimes even controlling all the data, etc. And then you said you were worried about new entrants with the EU regulation coming along. But isn't there also a problem that when there are new entrants and new technologies, often they are bought by the big companies, and the competition doesn't really develop? How to think about this?
So let I start things with the taxes question. Maybe one remark, in Germany, we now introduced or strengthened our tax deduction for research and development. Yeah, and that's a big step in so far that before we steered technology with our Fraunhofer Institute, our mission oriented, we had project financing. Now, if you have tax deduction, it's across the board, so that we don't care where innovation happens, everyone can tax deduct. So I think it's a good step if you want to really have a horizontal measure. The question was not about tax deduction, but by increasing taxes. Yeah, so the wealth tax, actually, I never thought about it. It's surely you can make the argument that income, labor taxation, in a way, makes labor more expensive. And we have seen many innovations. Simon was making this point, because labor is so expensive. Yeah, so many technological advances came because labor was expensive. So if you make labor cheaper, which you would do if you reduce taxation, yeah, so maybe you see less innovations. Yeah, wealth taxes is interesting. I mean, I have to think about what influence it has, because wealth taxation means you reduce the incentive to increase wealth. And in a way, those people, who create wealth are also innovators. At least if you don't, if it's not a heritage, you innovate. And many of the rich people have, founded companies and became rich. So the other point, and I think that's a very interesting topic, is we have these huge companies, and they have strong influence where innovation is going towards to. And we see this, we have these killer acquisitions, so they buy others and, and close them down. But sometimes, that's one reason, because that firms want to be bought and killed, because if you have an innovation, as a story, when 5 years ago we wrote a report, and when you have a startup, you are typically writing in your startup what's your product and what's your exit strategy. Yeah, so what happens after 5 years? Yeah, and with the Berlin crowd, many of these companies wrote exit strategy Google, because they expected to be bought by Google. Yeah, and if you have that expectation, you do different kind of innovations. So you don't innovate to overcome Google, yeah, but you innovate to be bought by Google, yeah, and it's a complete different steering of innovation, yeah, and so there's really something to competition policy that they should aim to help innovation not just grow in this, how can I help Google direction, yeah, or being bought by Google and get closed down, yeah, but how can I help innovation to be the next Google, yeah, and so we have these attempts like the Digital Markets Act, which gives them data, yeah, so Google has to provide them with data, so it helps them to it's not just Google, it's also Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon and so on, yeah, so we have these instruments, but they just started. So Digital Markets Act came into into power last year. So we still need some time to see whether that works, the regulation we have in Europe.
So that gives me great points to turn to you, Simon. Well, first you may of course also comment on the wealth and versus income tax question, how how they influence innovation, if you think that's clear cut. And also, I think this idea, that now that many startups want to be bought rather than become, family companies and have their great-grandchildren still steer the company. So which kind of societal institutions do we need so that people aim for that? But finally, I want to throw in also a third point, 3 different points. A question, great question by Colin McCullough from the audience who says, well, globally more than 50% of the population don't use artificial fertilizer for their food production, and about 35% don't have access to the internet. And those are just examples. And so he's asking, well, is the big problem not really the divide in access to technology and skills and rewards within developed countries, but then beyond that, the divide between developed and less developed countries? So how to think about that? Simon.
Right. Well, I'll start with the last question, Nicola, because I don't think we've gone there yet, and it's super important. I think that there's this literature from the 1960s and 70s on so-called inappropriate technology, where the concern was that capital-intensive technology was developed in countries like Europe and the United States, and that it became available to lower-income countries at an earlier stage of their income development, let's say, than had been the case with those countries, the originators. And that was a problem because that generated fewer jobs, fewer well-paying jobs than they needed. I think there's some definite validity to that. And I think there's a lot more concern, should be a lot more concern now that in addition to not being connected and not having access to these technologies, the way in which the technology comes, like ChatGPT, for example, which was available everywhere very, very fast, immediately made it less attractive to hire people for whom English is not their first language to do a first draft of a document, because ChatGPT can do a not very good first draft quite well. In fact, the later versions of GPT will be even better. So I think there's a disruption coming. Most of this generative AI doesn't work yet in manufacturing because manufacturing is not sufficiently digital, but a lot of people we're in contact with in manufacturing want to make their environments more digital so they can bring in the latest AI and use that technology to eliminate some of these partially routine tasks. A lot of routine tasks are already done by machines, but things that have a little bit of non-routine activity involve humans. Again, I think there's many, many jobs around the world that are in the line of fire there. On the wealth tax, well, I don't want to reinforce the stereotype, Nicola, but I worked for Elizabeth Warren on her presidential campaign in 2019, and we called for a wealth tax to help pay for Medicare for all, because there's a big problem of healthcare costs and containing that and the structure of healthcare in the US. And to Achim's very good point, if you're reducing the cost of employing labor, so in the US it was payroll taxes, paid by the employer, partially passed on to the employee in lower wages, surely, but definitely paid by the employer. Anything you could do to reduce that tax burden would be helpful. And the billionaires I know don't actually know how many billions they have. They know it's billions. They feel good about that. If it's a wealth tax at that level, I really don't think you're disincentivizing anyone. The good question about competitive entry and also, is it good to want to be bought by Google? My family made screws in Sheffield for over 100 years. And it was a small company. It was family owned, never went anywhere, doesn't exist anymore. I'm not recommending that sort of permanent micro business type of approach in the modern world. And sure, if you're looking for a premature exit or you're looking just to sell to Google, that might make sense that would still your strategy or make you a little less ambitious. It's going to be hard to counter that given the power of these companies, as you said, Nicola, globally, and also the fact that the US is not going to take action against these companies. They see these companies as an essential part of national security right now, in addition to what they may be able to contribute to national prosperity.
So I think Georg Schäfer's question fits in here very well. He's asking, should the big company, well, you say it will not happen, but should the big tech companies be broken up to create a level playing field again? Yeah. What do you think, Simon?
I think there will be some advantages to breaking them up. I mean, I think that's a complete waste of time politically, and I prefer not to waste my time politically. I prefer to take on things that are really, really difficult but doable. So I think finding ways to prize the technology from them, to push them in this labor augmenting way, to encourage other parts of the value chain to be built that pull in that direction, to change corporate mindsets and to change the philosophy of shareholder capitalism in the United States. These are all daunting tasks, Nicola, but I think they can all be tackled, and we are working on them. Breaking up Google, Microsoft, Amazon, very, very, very hard, harder than any of those other things.
But
Thank
let
you.
me, if I may,
Yeah.
because that's
Yeah.
the point we had many debates about. It's one thing is whether it's possible, but the other thing whether it makes it's helpful. Yeah, and if if Facebook, so you have a Northern Europe Facebook and a Southern Europe Facebook. Yeah, what does it mean? And will it not, because of these network effects, will it not in the end be one Facebook again, and then it was a different name? Yeah, so it's really hard to make an economic case for breakup. But there are good economic cases for example, that they have to provide data to competitors. That say you have multi-homing, that you can go to different platforms without being hindered on doing that. That there's no self-preferential treatment. So I think what the DMA is doing in Europe is really one step in that direction. And my feeling is, if there's a really good case for breaking up, one should do it, because they are these. But it's hard to make that really good case. And at the moment, I think with the measures installed, like data, they have to provide the data. We are trying to steer competition rather than getting into this debate whether breaking up will help.
Well, one thing I always wonder is with these social media, where you have these big network effects like Facebook, right? Shouldn't it be technologically possible, like with the telephone, it used to be a monopoly, and then one found ways to basically convince phone companies to be compatible, so you could phone from one company to another. And I think at least for some social media, there should be a possibility. You're exchanging photos, right? You're exchanging films and some text. So why wouldn't it be possible that, I don't know, I can choose another Facebook which protects my data better, whatever. I don't get as much ads, and I still can shift all of my content to my friends. I mean, there I'm one. It's not a breakup, strictly speaking, but it would make it easier for firms to enter. Is that not something one should try to steer a little bit? Achim?
I'm sure I can say a few. So one thing is that with the Data Protection Act, you can take your data with you. So for example, you can take your Google search history with you to a competitor of Google. And there are no attempts that you can, you don't have to ask, and it takes a week to get it, but you can take it instantaneously. So so that you can you have, I don't know, a music list, and you take it instantaneously to the competitor. So that's one instrument. And yes, the other one is the compatibility across different services. Actually, telecommunication is quite complicated, but it's really simple compared to these social platforms. So I think in the DMA there are some measures to have interoperability and to easily switch between the system, but I'm not sure whether that will lead us so far like it's helped us in the telecommunication sector.
And Simon, to go back to you had your 3 points, new task creation, trade unions, democracy. And here's a question for you from the audience. So Stefan Grönebaum, he's asking, well, is there a specific political, he calls it economical constellation that fosters the development of innovations best in your view? So some time ago, we thought about the Asian development, Asian tiger, states development that were a little bit authoritarian, bureaucratic, he says. That wouldn't be easy for us to copy. But do you think there's a political system for which you could say, well, that would foster innovation and would really foster perhaps the kind of innovation we have in mind in our book, where you can legitimately say it's progress?
Yes, there is a potential moment coming, Nicola. You may not like this one. Okay, let me just say that. But there is a lot of bipartisan concern in the United States about so-called competitiveness of the United States. Some people would say with regard to China, actually the House Republican framing, and I'm quite serious about this, is competitiveness of the United States with regard to the Chinese Communist Party. That's how the document is entitled, actually, that's now circulating. I do think it's a little bit dangerous. I do think there's an excessive rhetoric of confrontation. However, it is a conversation that people on the right and the left are aligned with and can support different versions of it. Now, what does competitiveness mean? It means something about industrial capacities. It means something about encouraging certain sectors. It means certain expectations for jobs. I think this conversation is fairly early. It could become highly protectionist, Nicola, which I would not recommend. I think it's very dangerous, particularly protectionism that will be lead to trade war with our allies like Europe. That is not what we want, in my view. But I think there's another pathway in which it could be very focused on exactly what you're asking about, what Achim's saying, what I'm saying. There is a pathway there where you can get more innovation, more dynamism, more good job creation, more augmentation of humans. Will we find our way onto that path? I don't know, but I think that is what we're trying to work on. That is worth pursuing, in my view. Some people put this under the heading of industrial policy or industrial strategy. You can do that if you want. I think defining competitiveness, defining industrial structure, defining mechanisms for encouraging the sort of innovation that you want. I think that's language that I think can get traction in the United States.
And I have another question for you from the audience again. So you already made it clear that breaking up the big tech didn't seem it was very feasible. But Roger Hoitzman wants to know how you view FTC chiefs Lina Khan's approach to the big tech companies. And he didn't make it, well, you can choose which part of her actions you want to comment on.
I think Lina has done a good job of bringing attention to some of their behavior. I think the way that customers are treated, for example, and I think we're behind. I mean, let's be clear, we're behind Europe on data portability and the potential to switch services. I think Europe is doing us a big favor by pushing hard on that legislation. The lobby here is much stronger. So Lina has a very steep uphill to climb. I think that trying to put these companies in a regulatory box is super difficult. I would rather work on new things, create more, the end run, if you like. Both those things can be complementary. Of course, it's always about the narrative, Nicola. It's all about, is this good? Why are we doing this? Should we just do more of this, or should we do something different? We talk about this all the time in the United States. We're probably boring about it, honestly. But it has to be said. It has to be central, because without that critique, and the critique that Lina is providing, you don't get to, people find it much less interesting or potentially compelling when you propose alternatives.
Okay, make one, actually frame it as a question, because my understanding was that that was actually bipartisan, that you have to go more strict against the big the digital companies, yeah. But with Ms. Khan, it becomes more political in a sense. So she's, competition policy becomes more a political issue than a technocratic issue, put it like that. I would say in Europe, the Digital Markets Act, or also in Germany, the competition law, it's, it's also politics, yeah, but it's much less right-left politics. It's, what works, what does not work, yeah. So I see one risk that because the topic becomes so political in the United States that, if there's a new election coming up, then we will see a shift again in the other direction.
Well, look, you're right that there are some complexities here, including that it's the Republican Party that generally doesn't like regulation, but they also don't particularly like the tech sector, although nobody's quite sure how they feel about Elon Musk. And the whole thing is, goes around and round. I would say that regulation of the sector is very unlikely in the United States. I can see some spaces around surveillance, for example, around workplace safety, yes. And I can see plenty of things that might be encouraged, new things might be encouraged. But other than that, there is this concern, some legitimate basis, but it's also exaggerated by the lobby, that China will overtake the United States and dominate technologies in a way that will be detrimental to national security. This comes up a lot in conversations, maybe on the sidelines, but it's absolutely in people's minds. And so I just don't see even the Democrats even if the Democrats were much stronger on Capitol Hill, I don't see that they would have enough votes to pass the kind of restrictions that you are considering in Europe. And I don't see the Republicans going along with that at all. Hearings where you drag CEOs in and you embarrass them for having dinner with Xi Jinping, sure, absolutely. But something more systematic in terms of regulation, that is not what's going to change outcomes in the US.
And Achim, I have another question for you, I would say, from Lucy Kirstein. She asks, so in addition to the legal acts that you already mentioned, how do you view the overall proposals of the European Commission on technological sovereignty, the IPCEIs, the actions in the Digital Europe program? Can this change how we innovate in the digital and data domain, or do you see major issues with these programs? How do you assess this?
Yeah, that's. I think it's a very relevant topic. How do we position ourselves in Europe with regard to technological sovereignty? And if I compare what is being done in Brussels and what's being done in Berlin, we have an industrial policy in Berlin, yeah, and with the Berlin policy, it's much more focused on production and what we do, next year. So technological sovereignty means what happens in 10 years. So are we at the edge, in 10 years time? It doesn't matter where we are next year, innovation, matters in 5 and in 10 years. And here I would say the IPCEIs are doing a good job because they have this innovation perspective. So, it's not in general, not all of them in all aspects doing a good job, but the logic is doing good, because it has this innovation aspect in hydrogen and these other fields. But on the other hand, we see a lot of regulation coming from Brussels, which is really hindering the small firms to do the innovation. So I would say it's a mixed bag. When we can agree upon that we want to have, being at the front in 10 years and not next year, and not in 2 years' time. Yeah, that would help. And then so like the CHIP Act is not about innovation. That's about producing chips. And I'm not sure whether in 3 years we need chips or in 5 years need chips. What we need is to have the most advanced chip technology in 10 years' time. So I would spend much more time on research and development, much more money, not time, on research and development than on paying for production or paying for building a company. Yeah. So and so that's why I mean, but it's a mixed bag. So some instruments I think do this job. The others are really, industrial policy helping industries to survive for the next 3 to 5 years.
And yeah, Simon, you can intervene on this one, and then I have another question for you.
My next book, Nicola, which is still under development, has a lot of material in it on the development of the aviation industry between World War I and World War II. And what's interesting about that, so sometimes people talk a lot about we want to produce things in order to be close to research and development, to be able to innovate better and then produce more effectively. So that innovation production loop. There's lots of twists and turns what happened in the 1920s and 30s, but that loop I think was absolutely prevalent, that people who produced and actually had to make engines for aircraft, and they were producing them, they were also innovating, and the people who were doing the production had ideas about innovating, and that feedback loop was very tight, well, particularly because of the circumstances that developed, obviously. But I think that's a question, Achim. I mean, if making chips makes us better at innovating, that's a strong argument. If making chips is really, if we can really divorce that or have that done in Taiwan or wherever you feel is geopolitically stable, then yes, I completely agree. Focus on the R&D. And I think that's the 5 to 10 year logic is a very powerful one. But the feedback loops, I mean, that's why I drive 2 German cars. I only drive one at a time. That's why I have 2 German cars, I think, because they were those companies were in the past very good at that kind of loop.
If I may, I fully agree, and I'm curious to read your next book. Yes. So tell me when you have written it. No, but one point I want to make is, it's not black and white, and also, subsidizing production helps innovation. But there's one thing, I think, a case which can be made that's in particularly helpful if you have small and medium-sized enterprises, because they don't have a department for research and development. So they do their development while producing. So these are the small firms. But what we are doing here, we are subsidizing the large steel companies. We are subsidizing the large aluminum companies. They have their research and development departments. So there's this feedback is still there, yeah, but it's much, it's much less important, I think, to go that way than it is with small and medium-sized companies.
Very good point. But let me add, while this is aircraft, a bit of an obsession, Nicola, the airship industry, which was also in the 1920s, because Germany was ahead in airship construction, as you know, the British were convinced that that was the future of long-distance air travel, and they set up two rival enterprises to try and innovate. One was run by the government, and one was run by the private sector. And I think Achim nodded, he knows how that story ends, which is the government one had an absolutely cataclysmic crash in which the relevant government ministers and almost all the designers died. I mean, it's a complete and utter tragedy. So the lesson that was drawn from that, maybe prematurely, but I think pretty accurately, was having large government enterprise try to push the frontier and have the politics of that intertwined, right? They pushed for it to fly to India to demonstrate something or other about the empire at some moment. It just wasn't ready to go, but it became politicized. And so I think more incentives for innovation, more incentives for the private sector, more incentives for new companies. Achim's absolutely right. That's what we should, that's the frontier. That's what we need.
And well, I still have questions from the audience, but now I have to bring in one of my own, because this chips company that's being subsidized here. So the argument also goes a little bit, and the loop, I think that's very interesting, production, innovation. The argument that's sometimes made is, well, you know, if you can create an ecosystem where you have the company, it's producing, and then there are universities or that will produce innovation, and some suppliers that will then also innovate, then it's a good investment perhaps. But you know, some people say this will not happen, and others say it will happen. But are there any, from all the books you've written, Simon, are there any conditions where you can say, oh, you know, if you do it this way, why not subsidize production of something that you think is really relevant and where you want to generate innovation, so that Simon still drives those German cars in 20 years' time? Are there any conditions we can identify?
So my previous book, Nicola, was called Jumpstarting America, written with John Gruber, and we argued for a big commitment to science and R&D in a more fundamental sense, so that with big spillover effects. And the story about that book is I met with a senior staff member from the Senate in February 2019, February 2020, and the book came out in 2019. And he said, Simon, it's a very nice book, well written, but we're not going to do that. We have lots of other things, lots of other more important priorities. No money for that. That was the last meeting I had, and maybe the last meeting he had before COVID shut down everything, Nicola. And what we learned from that was that building scientific capacity as much as possible across as broad a frontier as possible is both good for the things you know you want to do, like better treatments for cancer, but also because that scientific capacity is what you mobilize in the event of a crisis, and you reposition. So the people at Moderna say it took them, 24 hours to figure out that once they saw the genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2, to figure out how their particular technology could be redeployed to develop a vaccine, which ultimately became a rather successful vaccine. So I think that our answer for the US, Nicola, is more science, do it as much as possible. Yeah, sure, clusters are good, ecosystems are good, having places specialized in certain areas, totally fine. But mostly spend more money on basic science and R&D, because the spillover effects are very big, and it's hard for the private sector to capture those fundamental investments, the full value, and therefore they underinvest in them. So go look for the places where there's a big social positive return and big spillover effects, and then try to get as much of that captured within your country or between your country and your allies, as opposed to leaking out to some other part of the world that may be increasingly hostile to you.
And we have little time left, but I have to take you to one of the very high-level questions in the audience now that concerns the great title of your book, because I think it's Jan Prive who asks, well, you know, your terminology, technical progress vis-a-vis innovation. So surely not any innovation is technology, it's also progress. And so what does it take to make sure that innovation is really progress? in one sentence.
Well, we wrote 500 pages on this. Just to go back to the Haber-Bosch process, because Achim mentioned it, it's a very important process. But to remind everyone, and make sure people have not forgotten or they can look it up, that this process was also used, version of this process, and the same scientists also worked on the development of poison gas in World War I. And by the way, so did the British scientists and the American scientists, and probably the French as well. So everybody was doing it. And I think this is the problem, Nicola. So economists love the law of unintended consequences, right? We delight in it because we let us, point out other people's problems. But there's also, I think, a law of intended consequences, which is, you know, when you want a goal and you work for it, you have a chance of getting there. But my friends who play basketball assure me that you make 0% of the shots you don't take. So what is it that you want to invent with technology? What is your goal? What resources are you putting into this, and how much progress are you making? It's not an unreasonable question. And to say, you know, I want Google and Microsoft to be bigger and more profitable. Okay, well, that's a goal. It's not my goal, but maybe it's probably their goal. We have some other goals. I think more good jobs would be my bumper sticker, what I put on the back of my German cars if I use bumper stickers. More good jobs, I think, is what we lost. What we built in the American economy, the German economy, other economies. We built it over 100 years, 150 years, and we, in the US, took our eye off that ball, and we lost that middle class, middle income, middle educated jobs, and push those people down to the lower end of the labor market where the competition is pretty intense and you don't get paid a good wage. Okay, why? No particular good reason. There wasn't a plan. Nobody said, hey, let's do that. It was, you know, forgetting or not paying attention to the base of modern prosperity. So let's go back there. Let's reorient our economy in that direction. That's what we're calling for. And I think it can be done. The US is certainly capable of doing it. I'm optimistic about Europe. I worry again, Nicola, about 6 billion other people who live in societies that are less open, less productive, less able to grapple with these issues, less able to deploy policy in constructive ways.
Yeah, so thank you, Simon. I have one last question for you, perhaps, Achim. I'm not sure I understand it entirely, but let's try. Carolina is asking, I mean, there's a lot to say about this. Carolina Schütt is asking about intellectual property, whether you see this as a problematic aspect, she asks, of AI, or rather a monetary concern for only advanced economies, which prevents technological distribution worldwide. So I'm guessing she's asking whether there can be, you know, what's the right degree of intellectual property protection, I assume. Some thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, there are two topics I would say. One is, you know, how we have technologies in the, you know, developed countries and those going over to the developing countries. Yeah, and that's a big problem. That's, you know, it's in AI, digital technologies, but in particular in pharmaceutical products and medical products. And we see that the pharmaceutical companies are not inventing into direction which are helpful for the developing countries. And a lot of committees are dealing with that problem. The other one is, what is the right property rights in the digital age? And, you know, I don't have the answer. We had so many debates on whether you should be the owner of your data. You should have property rights on your data. And there are so many good arguments that it's not the data which you protect, but, you know, how to deal with the data and the competence behind it. And if you protect it too much, but that's what we see in Europe with the Data Protection Act, yeah, that it really hinders innovation to come. Yes, so I think it's a perfect question, and I would love to hear the answer from, but I guess we have to test it out. Yeah, we have to get more experience with that.
We'll do another shortcut on this, and you know, Thomas, he switched on his camera, which means that we are at the end of our debate. A fascinating debate. Thank you, Simon. I really have to. I'm a bit, as I said, in my bed with really heavy book, Power and Progress. I was often buried under it, but I will have to read your other books. Now that you told me what I can expect there. I have one little critique. I mean, I also read Achim's books, which are, for example, on, well, let's reduce CO2 emissions, and they're easier to carry, you know. So, but they're also very good. So, but anyway, thank you, Achim. Thank you, Simon, for a great debate. We could do many more of those. I learned a lot. Thanks a lot. And thanks also to the audience for many really, really good questions, which made my job really easy today.
Thank you, Nicola, for moderating the session. And thank you, Simon and Achim, for this indeed excellent discussion. I think we're at the beginning, in a way, of reconsidering some of these questions. And I mean, it's always interesting to see the critique, not that, you know, you can always find critique of directed change or whatever innovation policies in that way. But that doesn't mean that the analysis of something has gone wrong or may go wrong. In history, it has gone wrong, and we have some very serious social problems in these days in the US. But we also linked to technology, so I think it's really important to think about it, and maybe then think about new ways, which may be more effective than the old kind of industrial policies. So that's been, I think, not the beginning, but a step, and your book has been an excellent contribution, and we will continue to discuss all this next year when the election in the US will take place. It will be a very important moment for this. So this is to close the year also for us, nearly, we are at least the office year. Thanks you for participating, and we'll see you soon and back next year. Have a good day, have a good evening, and see you